usually do with a review is to start from the farthest back and then to go to the most recent. So I'm probably not going to cover everything. One thing that I made a decision to do is to not ask you any questions on the objective part that covers cultural ethical relativism. Okay. So there won't be any questions on Gilbert Harman's article or on that. Now, that is still an option if you want to write one of the essay questions on it. You're, definitely, you may do that, and that's perfectly fine. But I just decided to limit the test to the stuff on Sartre, on Aristotelian virtue ethics, and on utilitarianism, which is enough. And it's something that you have PowerPoints on all three of them, basically. So this review sheet more or less covers the main points in these views. Sartre, as I said, wrote that article, Existentialism is a Humanism, to respond to criticisms, that existentialism is a philosophy that emphasizes the negative parts of human nature, that it makes morality a matter of individual choice. Now, I frankly don't think he's successful in responding to that one. My own opinion, and the opinion of a lot of other people who've written on Sartre, is that his view of morality is what was called subjectivism, that it's person relative, that whatever I call right is right. He tries to hedge that by saying, well, what I call right, I also decide it should be right for everyone. But Kant can pull something like that off, and we'll see that that's similar to what Kant says, but Sartre can't. When he says that the soldier wanting to make a moral decision about whether to be with his aged mother in France or go to Great Britain and join the, Free French up there to invade later on. Sartre basically says, look, just choose, and you make something right by choosing it, but make a choice. And when he says, which is to say that, yeah, it's your choice that makes it right, not the other way around. So anyway, I don't want to dwell on that, but those are the criticism that he was trying to respond to. Well, there are religious existentialists and there are atheistic existentialists. Sartre bought into Nietzsche's 19th century claim that God is dead, which was his view that God is an irrelevant concept for contemporary society and contemporary human beings. There are some there, if you can pick one up. So Sartre is an atheistic existentialist. There are religious existentialists. He's not one of them. Now, the belief that all existentialists share, what makes you an existentialist, is that, especially as regards human existence, existence precedes essence. Now, the essence of a thing is its basic essential nature. The essence of a triangle, we'll see that when we come to Descartes, is to be a plane geometric figure with three sides and three angles. Those are its essential qualities, right? And Sartre basically denies that there's any pre-existing human essence. If there is one, we make it up. So existence precedes essence. We first exist, and then we define our nature. We define it as a society collectively, but also as individuals, we decide what we want to make out of ourselves, is basically what it comes down to. So essence precedes existence, then, is the first principle of existentialism and the belief that all existentialists share. And the first principle is that you're nothing but what you make of yourself. Now, how would humans be like a paper knife if they were created by God? Well, a paper knife is a created product, right? Someone had to design it, had to draw up plans for what it would be, and those plans would specify the essential qualities of the paper knife, and then it would have to be built. Well, for something like the paper knife, its essence preceded its existence. That is, somebody had to think up what it is first and then build it. And if we were created by God, then God would have a plan, a blueprint for who we are as human beings, and then would make us according to his pre-existing plan. And so our case, if God were around, is that like the paper knife, our essence would precede our existence. But remember, Sartre is an atheistic existentialist, and so for him, God is not around to specify who and what we're to be. And so we must first exist, and then we have the responsibility of defining our nature and defining morality. And this basically is humanism, that the things like truth and morality are not out there to be discovered by us, but that we make truth, we make reality, we make who we are. So this responsibility is a sense of anguish for us because we realize it's our responsibility to define who human beings are and what morality is. A good example of this, the 20th century philosopher Richard Rorty agrees with Sartre in a lot of this stuff, though he's not an existentialist. And he says, well, look, consider the philosophical question of whether an android is a human being. And what Rorty says is that question will be answered not by something we discover about the nature of androids that we didn't know before, or about our own human nature, but that question will be settled when we decide collectively as human beings whether we're going to let androids into the mix, whether we're going to call them human. So, in other words, truth isn't out there to be discovered by us. We make it. We decide who's going to be a human being. This is Sartre's view. So sometimes we react to this responsibility by wanting to run away from it and pretend that we're not free, that we're determined, that we're constrained to a particular morality. Remember, the reason we first looked at Sartre is not just for his ethics and his views of human nature, but for the fact that he has the opposite type of view on free will, as does somebody like de Holbach or Laplace. For Sartre, our will is not determined by genetic factors, by environmental factors, by any physical factors, and it isn't even to be constrained by pre-existing morality. I mean, somebody who's Roman Catholic might say, well, one of us is pregnant, but abortion is not an option for us. We feel like, we are morally obligated by our faith to bring the baby to term. See, Sartre would have disagreed with that. He would have said that that is somebody saying that they're constrained by traditional morality. So you can see where Sartre is really trying to shatter a lot of the beliefs in traditional morality as well. So we try to escape our responsibility by pretending that we're not as free as we really are. And Sartre calls this acting in bad faith. And for him, it's the only moral no-no. Do not act in bad faith. So the distinction between being in itself and being for itself. We as human beings are being for itself. That is, we make these active choices for ourselves as we go along about who we're going to be. And sometimes Sartre says it might be future plans that determine our present choices. I want to get into the nursing program. I need a philosophy course, or I need a liberal arts course, therefore I'll sign up for one. Well, it wasn't something in the past that caused you to make that decision, but a future plan about who you want to make yourself out to be. So we're being for itself, being in itself. Sartre still thinks in the natural world, things are determined in much the same way that Laplace or de Holbach would have thought. But he believes the case of human beings is entirely different. And while a Laplace or a de Holbach doesn't place much value at all in this subjective feeling we have that we make free choices, for Sartre, that's the starting point of his whole philosophy. Sartre is not going to read scientific journals to find out what he ought to believe in philosophy. Sartre says, my starting point is my own subjective experience. So he's convinced that we make free choices. Now, as far as morality, he thinks that we're abandoned to make our choices on our own. We don't really have any guidance from within because he doesn't trust things like feelings or conscience. Or without, he says, even if we try to seek advice, that advice that we get could be advice that will change depending on who we choose to get the advice from. So the implications are that we're not going to find any universal moral truths, and all of our moral guidance has to come from within. Now, there are times when I do Sartre and we emphasize his moral views a little more than we did here. Nothing can give us a sign. So at any rate, so when it comes down to determinism, we define determinism as, the view that all of our choices are conditioned by prior causes that, given past ensures the same future depending on the causes. A unique past ensures a unique future. So Sartre is the very opposite of a determinist. He will allow the things in nature are determined, but as far as human beings goes, he thinks we make entirely free choices. Now, facticity, he does mention that, well, okay, I don't have entire freedom. Sometimes other people can constrain me in my choices, or sometimes, I mean, I can't make the choice to walk across North Avenue and get hit by a car and it not affect me. I can't drink a deadly poison and it not affect me. Now, to a certain degree, I mean, I'll admit that an alcoholic might be able to drink a fifth of scotch in a day, whereas a person who's either not a drinker or not much of a drinker might kill themselves if they did that. But still, even an alcoholic is not going to develop an affinity for cyanide or strychnine or one of the real poisons. So now, so Sartre says, okay, there are aspects about us that are governed by these prior events and causes. He calls this our facticity. But he says, well, yeah, I still have the freedom to choose not to cross the busy street or not to drink the poison. Well, yeah, that's freedom, but I think that kind of changes the subject. You know, I don't think it answers the real question. And when Sartre brings in things like our facticity, I think he kind of gives away the game and admits that we are causally constrained by a lot of things that happen to us. You know, we're not as free as he suggests. So, so basically he thinks if other people try to restrict our freedom, we should, you know, rebel against that. I'm going to pause this thing for a second. The virtue of a thing is tied to its essential nature or function. For instance, the essential nature of a knife is to be used to cut things, right? And so virtue or excellence, the excellence of a thing would be to perform its essential nature or function well. And, you know, obviously a knife that cuts well. We don't, now if I, you know, if we were in my kitchen and we were preparing something and I needed to cut through something that was particularly difficult, and I said, well, look, get me that knife over there. That's a particularly virtuous knife. You would look at me like I was strange. We don't talk about knives as being virtuous. But the Greeks did use the same word. And here we're talking about excellently fulfilling its essential nature or function. So note, Aristotle, when it comes to human beings, is at the opposite end from somebody like Sartre. What, you know, Aristotle's going to try to say that there is something as an essential human nature. And so virtue for human beings is to fulfill our nature and to act in accordance with our nature. And so he thinks we're reasoning beings. There's a slide in there where he points this out. We share in common with plants and non-human animals the fact that we have biological functions. Okay? We share in common with non-human animals, but not with plants, the fact that we have an emotional life, that we can feel pain and pleasure. But Aristotle thinks that if you're talking about the type of reasoning that enables you to follow an argument through different steps and rationally generalize about things, Aristotle thinks that human beings are unique in possessing the ability to reason, and so he says that's what our essential nature, our essential function is. That's what's unique about us. And so, so just as the virtue or the excellence of a knife is to cut well, its essential function, so there are copies of this on the desk if you want to follow along. So if our essential nature is to reason, it's to use our reason in the intellectual area to investigate things about the world around us, and in the field of morality. So, and also Aristotle, and we saw this also with Socrates and Plato, though we didn't really stress it a lot. They're more concerned with what type of character traits does a good person, a virtuous person, have. What are good character traits for us to cultivate? They're not as much concerned as people like the utilitarians, as modern ethicists are, with how do I decide what's right and wrong? You know, in what's the right or wrong moral choice in this area? So now one of the things that Velasquez points out is that the most pressing questions that we have in ethics are usually questions about what's the right thing to do and how do I justify doing A rather than B morally. But still, there are virtuous character traits. You can have a lot of moral knowledge, but if you don't have the character, you know, to put into implication what you know, implementation what you know, then, you know, having a lot of moral knowledge doesn't really get you to the end. I think Socrates was wrong. He thought that to know the good is to do the good. And I think you can know the good without doing it. Well, at any rate, Aristotle believes that virtuous character traits are not something we're all automatically born with. And a person's either born a virtuous person or not. But he is convinced that we can develop virtuous character traits, and that developing a character trait in yourself is something that happens not overnight but over time as you make choices. He says developing a virtuous character trait is like developing a skill at playing a musical instrument, like a lyre or a harp or a piano. You know, you don't decide, well, I'm going to learn to play the piano, and you read a book on it, and tomorrow you're a pianist. You know, it's a skill that takes time. And as I said, it's a kind of circular thing. Aristotle thinks that by making, say, courageous decisions, we become more courageous. But then if we develop the virtue of courage in ourselves, it then also becomes easier, because we're acting in accordance with our nature more, to make courageous decisions in the future. So he thinks that we can produce virtuous character traits by habit, even if we have to go contrary to our nature. That is, even, and this is where he says reason comes in, where we have to act against maybe what we feel, you know, and make a courageous decision, or make a decision to be temperate and not eat the whole pie or something like that, or, you know, limited it to a piece of pie. So the virtues are acquired then, much like a skill on a musical instrument is acquired by practice, by exercising them. And here again, I said my dad was a carpenter through much of his professional life. his working life, and he actually went to school to be a carpenter on the GI Bill after World War II. So those were skills that he had to learn. And how do you learn? Well, you learn by doing. Aristotle says we learn to build by building. We learn to play the lyre, a musical instrument, by playing it. We become just persons by doing just actions. Now, he also thinks that developing moral virtue is something that actually occurs as you interact with other people in real society. You don't develop a moral virtue by getting alone in a lonely place in solitude and meditating, and all of a sudden you've developed the virtue of courage in yourself by meditating on courage. For Aristotle, it doesn't work that way. You develop it by making decisions, correct decisions. And the moral virtues are then social, and so I pretty much just said what I said. We become moral. We develop these by interacting with other human beings. Now, what is a virtue for Aristotle? Well, for him, a moral virtue is always the mean between two vices. A virtue is always the midway point between, on the one hand, a vice of deprivation, and on the other, a vice that has to do with excess. So temperance would be the midpoint between asceticism, denying the needs of your body, say for food and drink, and on the other hand, something like gluttony or drunkenness, going way overboard in that area. So the virtue is to be found in the middle. And the truly courageous person for him is not the person who does daring things because they have no fear. It's not having no fear, but it's having a proper amount of fear and knowing how to use your reason to overcome your fears and make the right decisions. So it's the midway point between fearing everything, right, cowardice, and fearing nothing, which could lead to foolhardiness. So we achieve the mean then by allowing our reasoning abilities to override what might be our own impulses, So that's where reason comes into play. Again, this is a point I made earlier. For Aristotle, reason is what defines us essentially. We're essentially reasoning beings. Now note, after Darwin, this line has been muddied, right? For Aristotle, the distinction between human reasoning and the non-human reasoning of, say, the higher primates is a distinction of difference. We're totally different from non-human animals. Whereas for evolutionary theorists, the difference between human reason and the reasoning of dolphins, primates, and border collies is a matter of degree, not a difference in kind. So, in other words, for evolutionary theory, we're sort of continuous in that respect with the non-human animals. For Aristotle, we're in a totally different category. So, as I said, plants just have biological functions. Non-human animals have biological functions and an emotional life, but only humans have reason as well for Aristotle, so that makes us unique. So happiness, now, see, Aristotle, unlike Socrates and Plato, who made a big deal of the afterlife and the fact that righteous people will probably fare better in the next life, Aristotle kind of was more concerned about this life. And so for Aristotle, the payoff for morality is not to be achieved in a better afterlife, but it's to be achieved here and now, in that he's convinced that moral people are going to be happier people. Now, I know not everyone is convinced of that nowadays, but that's Aristotle's, claim. And I think if you think about people who are some of the happiest people, some of them are on an even keel and they lead the most well-balanced, happy lives. So for him, happiness is the end of morality, which is more a feeling of well-being. And just like the utilitarians wanted happiness to be what is good for its own sake, so did Aristotle. He also thought that happiness is desirable for its own sake. So happiness he defines as activity in accordance with virtue. That is, doing the right thing, choosing the mean, is also going to produce happiness in you. And to do noble and good deeds are desirable for their own sake. So the virtuous life, he's convinced, is the happiest life, and it's also a life of moderation where you're seeking the mean point, the midpoint between extremes. Okay, so there's probably not much time to do, except that remember that for consequentialists like Bentham, consequences tell the whole story. They're what we appeal to solely to judge right and wrong. Remember, Bentham emphasized only the quantity of pleasure. They both claim to adopt hedonism. Happiness or pleasure is the one thing to be sought for in what we do morally. Morality is a matter of bringing about the greatest happiness for the greatest number. Only Bentham just took the simple view that all we need to be worried about is the quantity of happiness. And this led to the charge against utilitarianism that it gives us a low view of human beings because it makes no distinction between the happiness a pig gets out of eating slop and the happiness we might get from, reading Plato or poetry or going to the theater. Forget about what it says about. Well, first of all, so Mill tried to introduce quantity, but the problem is he thinks that that it's better to have a lower quantity of a higher quality pleasure. It's better to be Socrates, dissatisfied, having less happiness and pleasure, than a fool or a pig satisfied. Mill says, which one of us would trade places with the pig in the field, even if we were promised we'd have, we'd be as happy as a pig could ever be. None of us would take that deal, and it's because we can appreciate things the pig can't that make our lives happy and worthwhile. But in saying that we can have less happiness in these higher quality pleasures, he essentially abandons abandons hedonism, because what makes them unique is not happiness, it's some other quality they have that makes them valuable in themselves. And contemporary utilitarians are pluralists. They basically hold to a number of standards. Yes, happiness is good for its own sake, but so are things like the satisfaction of our human preferences and knowledge just for the sake of knowledge, stuff like that. So anyway, look over the PowerPoint on utilitarianism then, and be sure to bring your essay, a number 2 pencil. I'll have some, but the one way to make sure you've got a good one is to bring your own, and your Scantron form. And we'll see you Monday. Take care.